so what are we talking about in this class? Talking about, we're basing our class on this book by Frank Chester, The Portrait of God. It attempts to paint a full picture of God by looking at the entire Bible. And so we're going to be going through the entire Bible in this class. Of course, we don't have time to do that and read every verse of every chapter. So what we've done is broken it down into sections, and we're going to get a broad overview of the Bible. All right, this is kind of where we've gotten so far, and we'll do a review at the beginning of every class. There's an outline if you want to fill in the blanks. So first section was Genesis 1 and 2. All right, that's the world before sin. That's the creation. That's Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden. Everything is perfect. Everything is exactly the way God wanted it to be. But then in Genesis chapter 3, sin enters the world. All right, and the blank on your outline is background of redemption, salvation. Redemption and salvation becomes necessary because sin enters the world. And the common theme, the emphasis in those 9 chapters is that humanity is constantly rebelling against God. God at this point is dealing with mankind universally, and they just continue to rebel over and over again. You have Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit, they're in the garden. Then you have Cain murdering Abel. And then you have Noah and the flood, where the whole world is wicked. And then even after that, you have the Tower of Babel, where the people were even trying to make themselves out to be like God. And God, of course, is displeased with that. And over again, God punishes this wickedness, but he also shows mercy. He could at any time have wiped out mankind altogether. But fortunately for us, he did not. And instead, he had a plan to save the world. Then in Genesis chapter 12, the next section, you have kind of a turning point. And Abraham is introduced in Genesis 12. And here God starts to lay out his specific plan of how he is going to save mankind. And he makes a promise to Abraham that he will bless all nations through Abraham and his seed, all nations, that would include us today. And he starts working now through this one man, Abraham, and his descendants to bring salvation. Then the rest of Genesis deals with Abraham and his immediate descendants, all right? So Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And again, we should probably say this first 11 chapters, that takes place over thousands of years. But then when you get to Abraham, that's about 2,000 years before Christ. And then Genesis ends with Joseph. It actually ends with the death of Joseph. And Joseph, his extended family, are now in Egypt. And I think I've seen before, that's probably, I think it was about 75 or so people. So you have about 75 or so people, Israelites, in Egypt at the end of Genesis in chapter 50 there with Joseph. All right, and then you fast forward to Exodus chapter 1. This is now several hundred years later, and the Israelites have multiplied greatly. They're still in Egypt, but now there's a whole lot more of them. And this threatens Pharaoh, and so Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, and that doesn't really work. They still continue to multiply, and he comes up with a plan to kill the newborn males of the Israelites, and that doesn't really work either. But one of those males is Moses, and we're introduced here to Moses in this section. Of course, Moses is born through the cunning of his mother and sister. They place him in a basket in the Nile, and he's discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, and is then raised as an Egyptian. He later kills an Egyptian because he was abusing a fellow Hebrew, and has to flee. and he's gone for a while. And then after a while, God calls him and his brother Aaron to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to release his people, the Israelites. And so Moses does go back, somewhat reluctantly, but he goes back and, of course, tells Pharaoh to let the people go. And then you have Pharaoh doesn't do it, his heart's hard. Then you have the 10 plagues. And the last of the plagues is the killing of the firstborn. And that's where, now you're in Exodus chapter 12, that's where the 10th plague happens. And you have, of course, the Passover. So the angel of death passed over the firstborn of the children of Israel. So that's kind of where we get to in chapter 12. Pharaoh, after that 10th plague, does let the people go. The Passover meal is instituted here in Exodus 12, so that, of course, becomes very important going forward. Hey, ready to go? We'll take a break here, hear from the good work Agape is doing. So.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is our Agape Sunday that we have once a year here at University. And we'll be doing a special contribution later today to help support the work of Agape. We have Brother Steve Dewar, who is here. He's the Executive Director of Agape, and we'll just say a few words about the work that Agape is doing, and then I'll have a few more words to say during our service today as well. Steve?
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to be with you guys today. I'm Steve Dewar. I'm the Executive Director of Agape, and I want to share some exciting news with you. We just wrapped up about 40 days where we saw 10 children who've been in foster care be adopted by their foster families. It's 10 children who have permanency now who had uncertainty before. Now, math would tell you 10 children, 5 families adopted them. That's 2 per family, but that's not the way it works. 3 families adopted 1 child. 1 family adopted 2. That leaves 1 family that adopted a sibling group of 5 children and kept those kiddos together. And that family is taken care of and supported through this process because of you guys. You guys are making a huge difference in the lives of those children. I also want to share with you that we're reaching a milestone. June of 2022 was when the Dobbs decision came down to change the laws on abortion. Since that time, we were approaching serving 200 women who were pregnant and uncertain as to what life meant for them. We've helped those moms choose life. We've helped those moms, most of them, choose to parent their children well. But for the moms who said, I can't do it, we've helped them find an adoption plan that was the right fit for them, the family, and the child. So you're making a huge difference in the lives of hurting children and struggling women. And I want to say thank you for being a part of Agape's ministry. I'll be around between class and church, and also around afterwards as well. We have a table that's in the foyer area if you want more information. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Someone who has adopted 2 kids myself, I appreciate the good work that Agape does. And like he mentioned, after the Dobbs decision that allows states to outlaw abortion, the need has become even greater. And last time I saw the statistics, there's over 100,000 kids in foster care in the U.S. that are waiting to be adopted. There's another maybe 300,000 or so that are in foster care, but they may be trying to be reunited with their biological family or whatever. So we're not quite ready for adoption yet, but they still need care in the interim. And that doesn't even include all the kids like mine who were adopted right at birth. They were never actually in foster care, but they would have ended up in foster care if there was not somebody to adopt them. So I appreciate the work they do and hope you'll help out in any way that you can. All right, so back to our review here. I think I got to talking about the Passover meal. It's instituted here in Exodus 12, and of course that becomes very important throughout not just the Israelites' history, but even for us. I mean, you know, it's continued to be celebrated. And of course, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper that we celebrate today during the Passover meal. And I don't think that was any coincidence. Just like the Passover represented the Israelites' freedom from the bondage of Egyptian slavery, of course, the Lord's Supper represents our freedom from the bondage of sin through Jesus Christ. So I don't think that was any accident that he instituted it during the Passover. But that happens way back 1,500 years before Jesus in Exodus chapter 12. All right. And then here's the next three sections. Exodus, so Pharaoh releases the Israelites and they start heading toward Mount Sinai. And they take approximately 2 months to get there. That's in Exodus 13 through 18. And then once they get to Mount Sinai, they spend about a year there, and that's Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10. So it's half the book of Exodus, all the book of Leviticus, and the first, I guess, third or so of Numbers. And then after that, you got Numbers chapter 11. That's where they leave Mount Sinai and start heading towards the Promised Land. But immediately there's problems and unbelief occurs, and the story unfolds from there until eventually they end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and most of them die without ever seeing the Promised Land. So that's where we've gotten to, or where we're going so far. And Jordan last week, he went over this whole huge Exodus 13 all the way to Numbers 10. Of course, it's a huge section. I talked to Kevin middle of this week, and he was planning to do Numbers 11 through 14. I said, okay, what does that leave me? So anyway, we talked and decided to that I would just continue to hang out here in Exodus 13 all the way through Numbers 10. It's such a huge section. Jordan did a great job last week, but you really just can't go over all of that in one class period. So I'm going to try to make additional points to what Jordan made, try not to repeat him, but there's a lot of information there. So he did a great job, and we're just going to continue looking at that. I'm just going to kind of go through it chronologically and just try to hit the high points. I would recommend, we're not going to obviously read all that, but I would recommend maybe following along in your Bible as I just kind of go through it chronologically. And I'll have the specific, here, I made some sub-points from the main points, and I've got the scripture out there beside it. You can kind of follow along as I go through it, and you can look down at your own Bible, kind of see, what's going on while I'm talking about it. All right, so Exodus 13 through 18, the journey to Mount Sinai. Okay, you have the, of course, newly liberated Israelites, and they began their journey from this Egyptian bondage toward the Promised Land. And these chapters here, they mark kind of the transition from slavery to freedom, and from the Israelites' dependence on Pharaoh for their needs to their dependence on God for their needs. They were an enslaved people there in Egypt, but Pharaoh was providing them with food, clothing, and shelter. They actually bring that up several times later and say, why can't we just go back to Egypt where we had food? But now they have to learn to rely on God. And we'll see how the Israelites have trouble making this transition, all right? And I don't know the psychology behind all that. I mean, you would think somebody who's been freed would just be super happy about it. But really the same phenomenon happens today. I mean, we have people in prison who go to prison and are there for a long time. They're used to that. And then they will get out, and we have people that will purposely commit crimes so that they can go back to prison. So it's much the same way here with the Israelites. They weren't used to freedom, and they were used to relying on Pharaoh. And so that's kind of the problem they have here going forward. These chapters, they offer a lot of insight into the character of God, and also the challenges of having faith in times of uncertainty. but these chapters will highlight God's guidance, his provision for the Israelites, and then their response to that guidance and provision. All right, the first point up there is God's guidance and presence. Exodus 13, 17 through 22. So again, the narrative opens with God leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And immediately their journey did not follow the most direct path to the promised land. The Bible says this: when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. That's verses 17 and 18. So God's guidance here was not the most pragmatic in human terms, okay? Instead, it was designed to protect his people. So I think this, and I'm going to try to make an application of each of these points to us, but this detour shows that God's leadership often prioritizes what's best for us over just convenience. You know, a lot of times in our life, I think we see a path and we think that's the best path, that's the shortest path, that's the path I need to go on. But God has a different plan. He may send us on a more winding path, but we'll see at the end of it that that was the best path to take all along. And so that's what he does here with the Israelites. He doesn't take them on the most direct path through the land of the Philistines, but it turns out to be the best path. In verses 21 and 22 of that chapter, God manifests his presence as a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And these kind of visible signs of God kind of underscore a central theme in the Exodus story, which is God is not some distant deity, but he's present and active God for the Israelites. And it's the same today. You know, God for us is not some distant deity that, you know, we can't really approach or anything like that, but he's active and present in our lives. You know, we may not can see him in a cloud or a fire, but you can see him certainly in creation. You can see him through his word, and you can actively approach him through prayer. So again, just like with the Israelites, he was not some distant God. To get through all this, I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, so we'll move along here. Exodus 14, the crossing of the Red Sea. Of course, this is one of the most iconic scenes in all the Bible. Of course, we learned this one when we were a little kid, and movies have been made about it. And it shows God's power and his commitment to deliver his people. So the Israelites, of course, are trapped. I mean, God has led them on this path down to the Red Sea. And they're now trapped because Pharaoh has changed his mind. Now he's coming after them with his army, and they're trapped there between the army and the Red Sea. And they start to panic. Okay, they're in a frenzy. And let's see, it's verses 11 and 12 or 14. They start accusing Moses of just leading them out in the wilderness just to be killed. Okay, and so they are, like I said, in a frenzy. And I think this reaction by the Israelites reveals how fragile their faith is in the face of fear, which again is a recurring theme throughout this wilderness narrative. And in response to their panic, Moses says this, with the Egyptian army bearing down on them, Moses says this. This is one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. Exodus 14, 13, and 14. Moses says, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and all you have to do is be silent." Or some translations say be still. And, you know, I think that's a great point for us today. When we're in panic and fear, maybe what we need to do is fear not and just be silent, be still, and let the Lord fight for us. and he will. Sometimes we try to do too much for God, or we're too worried that God is not going to take care of us. But he will, and he did take care of the Israelites here. And of course, then you have the Red Sea is parted. The Israelites cross over on dry land, but the Egyptians then try to follow them, and the sea closes in on them, and they're all killed. And this, confirms God's role as both a warrior and a protector of Israel. They then celebrate that in Song of Moses in the next chapter. So the sea, it becomes a path of freedom for the Israelites, and becomes a path of judgment for the Egyptians. And this, of course, becomes a defining moment in Israel's history. It's mentioned several more times throughout the Old Testament, and then it's even mentioned at least once that I could think of in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul specifically mentions the crossing of the Red Sea. He kind of compares it to baptism. He says they were baptized in the sea, and just like they were delivered through the sea, we're delivered, of course, through baptism. His main point in 1 Corinthians 10 is a warning that even though the Israelites saw this great deliverance, they still end up falling into idolatry, and most of them end up dying and not getting to see the promised land. And it's a warning to us, even though we've received this great deliverance through baptism, through Jesus Christ, to not make the same mistake and never get to see the promised land, heaven. All right, so, and then moving on to Exodus 15, you have the Song of Moses, also called the Song of the Sea sometimes. It might be the heading in your Bible there, but so after this great deliverance, the Israelites respond with this song. I think this might be the oldest poetic text in the Bible, and it celebrates God as a divine warrior and one who's triumphed over Egypt. It says this in verse 2, "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." And again, we don't have time to read the whole song, but it recounts what just happened with the crossing of the Red Sea, and then it praises God for it. And it's a moment of community worship. All the Israelites join in singing this song. At the end, Miriam leads them in song and dance, and so you have this this community act of worship. And I think for us, it emphasizes the importance of, actually remembering and even talking about or retelling what God has done for us. All right, now Exodus 15:22 through 17:7. Here you have their testing in the wilderness, and then God always providing for them. You have really three instances in this section. At first they're thirsty and don't have water, and they're complaining about that. Well, they actually do have some, but it's bitter. So God makes it sweet, and they're able to drink. And then after that, they're hungry, and they complain about that. And God again provides manna from heaven, and he provides quail for meat. And then there's another episode where they're thirsty again, and this time God provides water from a rock. So each of these crises prompts complaints and doubts from the Israelites, but then provision from God, and it reveals the Israelites' immaturity in their faith at this point. God consistently responds with providing for them. And despite all that, despite his consistent provision each time, the Israelites ask this question in Exodus 17:7. Is the Lord among us or not? Okay? Even though they've already seen all this, the Red Sea, gotten water twice, the food, all this, they still asking, is the Lord with us or not? And, I think that tension between God's faithfulness and just human fickleness, if you will, it's a recurring theme in this journey, but I think it challenges us to look at ourselves and again, are we asking that question? Even though God maybe has provided for us many, many times in the past, are we still asking, is God with us or not? So I think it challenges us to examine our own faith and understand that God is with us. It's easy for us to shake our finger at the Israelites for having this not very deep faith, but we always have to look at ourselves and see if we're asking the same question. All right, let's move on to Exodus 17, 8 through 16. I have this victory through God's power and through human cooperation, all right? This is a story, I know we mentioned this story last week, but I can't remember exactly what all we said about it. But this is where Israel and the Amalekites go to war with each other. And Moses goes up on a hill, and as long as he holds his arms up, I think he's got a staff in his hand, as long as he holds his hands up, the Israelites prevail in the battle. But if he starts dropping his hands, the Amalekites get the upper hand. And he's tired of doing this. So Aaron and Hur go up with him onto the hill, and they hold his arms up, and he's able to then hold them up all the way to sundown, and the Israelites win the battle and rout the Amalekites. And I think this story demonstrates the interplay between the divine power and human cooperation. Okay, here and the same in our lives, like the victory goes to God. Okay, God wins the victory, but that doesn't mean that we can't, we can just do nothing. All right, He expects us to do what He wants us to do in order to achieve the victory, and not just us alone, but He expects others in the group to help out, and that's what we have here. So the Israelites, the victory's God's, but they wouldn't have won it if Moses wouldn't have held his hands up, and he wouldn't have been able to hold his hands up if Aaron and Hur had not helped him. So it's the same way with us. Okay, the victory's God's, but He expects us to do our part, and He expects us to help each other doing that. All right, Exodus 18. I got this as wisdom and delegation. What happens here is Moses' father-in-law shows up. He sees Moses is exhausted by judging all the people by himself all day. So he gives Moses some wise counsel and recommends that he get some other capable men to help him judge. Moses is still going to kind of be the Supreme Court in their structure, but get some other people to help him out. He takes that advice, and it works out well. And so again, it shows, I think, we need to allow other capable people to help us out when possible. All right, okay, that gets that section. Move along, because we only got about 10 minutes. So let's go to Exodus 19. Okay, now they actually arrive. That was all the journey to Mount Sinai. Now they're actually at Mount Sinai. Exodus 19, again, that begins with them arriving at Mount Sinai, and God tells Moses to ascend on the mountain. Let's see. And I guess I should say, really, let me just kind of give an overview of this whole section in case we don't get through it all, but it includes the covenant, it includes the giving of the law, and then the preparations for their journey to the promised land. And really, you see in the last section and this section, probably the main takeaway point is that God is preparing the Israelites for what's ahead. He's preparing them. He's obviously provided for them physically. All right, we've already seen that. But He also, especially with this, entering the covenant, giving the law, He's preparing them spiritually for their journey to the promised land. All right, so Exodus 19 begins with the arriving at Mount Sinai, and God calls Moses up on the mountain, and God proposes a covenant. Okay, a covenant is kind of a two-way street. Not that God needed anything, but a covenant requires action on both parties. And he says basically this: if Israel will obey his voice and if they will keep his commands, then he will make them, quote, a treasured possession, and quote, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's verses 5 and 6. So there's a qualifier, right, to this covenant. The Israelites have to keep God's commands in order to remain his chosen people. Of course, history tells us they don't really do that, and God ultimately rejects them and allows the Gentiles, of course, through Christ to become, his chosen people as well. And that's us today, spiritual Israel. And then you have, let's see, chapters 19 and 20. God there at the mountain, there's thunder and lightning and smoke. I think this just tells us about the awesomeness of God and his holiness. Then in chapter 20, you have the giving of the Ten Commandments, which is not just a moral code, but it's also the foundation of this covenant relationship between Israel and God. Then in chapters 21 through 23, you have some more laws that are given. These are sometimes called the Book of the Covenant. It kind of expands on the Ten Commandments and then applies those principles to daily life. And then in Exodus 24, Israel ratifies this covenant with a blood ceremony. Moses reads the Book of the Covenant, and the people affirm their obedience, and they make sacrifices. And the people declare this at this point in Exodus 24, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So this demonstrates that at the beginning, at least, they were very committed. But again, later events will reveal that their faith and obedience was somewhat fragile. All right, Exodus 25 through 40. You have the tabernacle, which is God's dwelling among his people, the Israelites. In Exodus 25 through 31, God gives very detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, which was this portable sanctuary, which symbolized God's dwelling among his people. And God sets out a very meticulous design, and they're supposed to use very precious materials. And I just think that reflects the sacredness and holiness, of course, of God. And just how awesome and great God is was the point, of course. Supposed to use the best. The narrative is then somewhat interrupted in Exodus 32 by the story of the golden calf. I'm going to kind of skip over that because I know we talked about that last week. So they make this golden calf, worship it, all that. We're familiar with the story. But then I think the maybe take-home point is then in Exodus 34, despite this great sin with the golden calf, God still, after some mediation by Moses, God still renews his covenant. And then one thing I've always found interesting about Exodus 34, God is passing in front of Moses, and God makes a statement about his own character. So if you want to know about the character of God, God spells it out here in Exodus 34. He says this: the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So I think, if you really want to understand how God's mercy and justice, how those work together, this passage here explains that God is very merciful, but he is also just. Where's the first bell? Okay. The tabernacle is completed in Exodus 40, and that's kind of the climax of the book of Exodus. You have him filling the his presence filling the tabernacle. And so now he's dwelling visibly among his people. All right, so let's talk about Leviticus in the 5 minutes we have left. Quickly go over kind of the whole book, the point of the whole book, maybe. So Leviticus, it focuses on these detailed laws of sacrifices, of ritual purity, of the priesthood, of holy living. Chapters 1 through 7, they outline the sacrificial system. Chapters 8 through 10 describe the consecration of the priesthood, and it kind of climaxes there in chapter 10 with the story of the tragic story, really, of Nadab and Abihu, who offered unauthorized fire, and the fire came out and consumed them, and they were killed. And I think the lesson there, obviously, is how much reverence that we're supposed to show and seriousness of approaching God. You know, we should never approach God. He is approachable, of course, but like we should never approach him in a flippant way. You know, one of the things that bothers me the most is when people take the Lord's name in vain, like say OMG or GD or whatever. Honestly, I'd rather you just hear you drop an F-bomb or something. I don't want to hear that either, but that's a crude. But it really bothers me more when people take the Lord's name in vain. We're supposed to, when we approach God, take it very seriously. And Nadab and Abihu didn't do that and were killed. Leviticus 11 through 15, that details laws on ritual purity. It covers food, skin diseases, bodily discharges, other things. Some of that may seem very foreign to us, but I think it served to show Israel was supposed to be distinct from the people around them, and it served to show that. And it was also to instill in the Israelites consciousness of holiness in their everyday actions. You know, so they would offer these sacrifices morning and night. They did all these other purity laws, and you know, it was to instill holiness in their everyday life. Get them to think about that. The Day of Atonement is in Leviticus 16. That's central to their religious life. It was an annual day for purification of the tabernacle and the people. And then finally in Leviticus 17 through 27, that's sometimes called the Holiness Code. And it really calls on the Israelites to reflect, kind of what I was already talking about, but to reflect on holiness in all areas of their lives. So it gives, it's a code that's about, you know, ethical behavior, sexual conduct, social justice, etc. And there's the repeated refrain, and this is probably the takeaway from the book of Leviticus. I think it's repeated 3 times in this section. But God says, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And that is really the takeaway point from the book of Leviticus, right? Let me finish this real quick. You might read Leviticus and you might think, well, all these laws, this is boring. But if you're doing that, you're missing the point, right? The point is for the Israelites to have these laws so that they could reflect God's holiness in their own lives. And of course, if you would have kept the laws perfectly, then you would be holy like God. But of course, nobody but Jesus was able to do that. And then the New Testament talks a lot about that, especially in Hebrews, and how we are now made holy, and we can reflect that through Jesus Christ. So I think that's really the take-home point. All right, got through it all, so appreciate it. Thank y'all.